It's well known that Randy Wicker organized the first public gay demonstration.
The first public demonstration for homosexual civil rights was at the Army Induction Center in 1964.
Randy is at his best when he's in collision with someone.
You pick a brick or a rock, they'll stop bullying you.
Randy got to be in the center of everything.
Every radio station, every TV station, everybody that wanted ratings wanted a homosexual spokesperson.
The drag queen is something we've been stuck with.
He is outrageous, crazy. He is a lunatic. He's also media savvy.
All homosexuals are considered to be very effeminate, ran around in dresses.
When one drag queen looks bizarre, that's the one that will get all the attention.
Randy is one of the most key figures in the early movement, the first militant activist on the East Coast.
Father Clement, what type of church is a Church of the Beloved Disciple?
We exist for the needs of the gay community, and I am gay myself.
Queen Bee was stinging mad. The cops had raided the Stonewall bar.
Randy Wicker, he's often left field, but whatever he's interested in, he's going to go and look for it.
I had committed political suicide.
Real animosity between him and us Stonewallers. And Randy to be right-wing, doing media, and representing us as right-wing, he was considered basically a media whore.
We're not going to put up with this anymore. We're going to raise hell until they give us our rights.
Randy was terrified at Stonewall that everything he and others had achieved would be blown away.
It wasn't generally wise policy to throw rocks at cops.
Randy is eccentric, to say the least. Unpredictable, could ignite in a second if got the idea something was unfair and ready to challenge it.
They were going to execute a puppy in front of St. Patrick's Cathedral.
He has a certain brashness. He is not hesitant at all about pushing an argument, promoting a cause. He's very effective that way.
I always wanted to have a family, and then suddenly cloning happened, and I thought, gosh, I could have a child and it wouldn't involve a stranger's genes.
And when you start talking to him, you're not sure where this conversation's going to go.
My name is Charles Gervin Hayden Jr. I was born February the 3rd, 1938 in Baltimore, Maryland. My mother always told me all through my childhood that she almost died having me. At the age of 5, my mother was taken away one night. She had tuberculosis. And my father told me later that I had come in the bathroom when I was 5 years old crying and said, "Daddy, why did Mommy run off and leave me in the middle of the night?" So I was left in the care of my grandmother and my grandfather, who was a police officer. When I was 6 years old, I went on a trip to Canada with my grandfather, and I met a little Canadian boy, and we went out in a boat, and we caught sunfish. And he was just so wonderful. I wanted to see more of him. And as far as I was concerned, when I think back, that was my first meaningful interaction with another male. When I look back on it, I realize was romantic. I started first grade at the age of 5. We were supposed to be 6. And I was bullied terribly when I was in grade school. There was something different about me they didn't like. When I told my grandmother this, that I'd been bullied, she said, "They're bullying you because you are superior. And if somebody is really bullying you, what you do is you pick up a brick or a rock. And when you pick a brick or a rock, you'll find that they'll stop bullying you." I lived with my grandmother till I was 12, and then I went to live with my parents in a small factory town in Pierce, Florida. And I heard, like many kids my age, how people reproduced. I heard about sexual intercourse. And like most kids, I didn't want to believe my parents did anything like that. I remember at the age of 12, I was laying in bed and I could hear the bed creaking. There was a bathroom between my mother's. It was a wood house, a factory town up on bricks. I came from a very poor background. And I heard this creaking of the bed and I thought, oh no, you know, my parents are doing that. My parents are doing that. I just came from a very puritanical background in that regard. The only thing my father ever said to me about sex is driving the car one day, he said, the world revolves around sex and money. I thought that was such an amazing observation of the world. And then at 12 or 13, found that boys turned me on. And then I heard in high school them talking about queers. And first, I thought, oh God, that's what I am. I realized looking back that these people had sensed that I was gay, because kids have a way of sensing that, but I had never once made any overture. I continued to be bullied all through high school. Then I went to Lakeland High School after the 10th grade, where I finally met civilized people and had a very wonderful year and a half, and I graduated. I was always a straight A student in math, but I was not well-read or well-educated, so I ended up looking for a college, and I enrolled in Washington and Lee University, an all-boys school. And I had picked an all-boys school because all these books filled with case studies talked about the rampant homosexuality in boys' schools. And if only I could meet just one other homosexual. It was an all-male, fraternity-dominated college in which most of the boys in the school spent most of their time sitting around talking about two things. Being able to get over to Bryn Mawr College, where the girls were on a weekend. The second thing was speculating about who in school was queer. Well, I met some people that were pretty obviously queer, and they told me about bars in New York City. And I went down and I bought a book. It was called Heart in Exile, a little paperback book. And in this book, this guy talks about being gay and seeing this sailor go into a bar and followed him into the bar. And at that point, I realized there were gay bars. There were places where I could find homosexuals in the big city. So when I went to New York City, I kept this diary in which I'd said that I discovered gay life and all kinds of interesting people and whatever, but my father found this diary, pried open the box and came and confronted me with it and told me that he had gone to a psychiatrist, told him I could never be changed, and that he wanted me to be the best adjusted homosexual that I could be, and would send me back to school as I got a psychiatrist okay. So I went back to college, transferred to the University of Texas. I started the University of Texas, and then I began a campaign to abolish student government, because student government was just stupid. And then somehow, very innocently, it went from abolishing student government to me becoming involved in student government. So the first time around, I ran with a guy on a ticket, and I got more votes than he did. I had a campaign to put Playboy back on the newsstands, challenging the PTA. They were going to increase tuition for in-state students from $50 a semester to $100 a semester. I marched on the Capitol, got thrown in the fountain. That put me on the front page of across the whole state. I became very famous as an agitator, and I narrowly lost the election. Now, in the process of this running for president, the dean of men called me into his office and said, "We have come to understand that you are a homosexual, and we cannot have a homosexual representing the student body of the University of Texas." What I learned at the University of Texas was that I could never pursue politics as a career. So I got just enough taste of the dirtiness of politics that I knew that a public political life was not possible for me as a gay person. After losing the election, I moved to New York City and started my activities with the Mattachine Society. And I went out to lunch with my father and showed him the Mattachine literature about how we were an educational research organization. And he looked at it. He said, "Well, it's your life. I don't think you're going to get very far with this." He said, "Just do me one favor, will you?" I said, sure, what was that? He said, don't involve my good name. Now, his name was Charles Gervin Hayden Sr. My name was Charles Gervin Hayden Jr. So I realized that I had to have a pseudonym. Worked at a bank with a girl who liked the name Wicker. For some reason I liked it because it sounded like Wicket. And then I saw a Randolph Scott movie. He gets off a boat and he's in a tuxedo. His name is Randolph. I thought, oh, Randolph. I became known in the movement as Randy Wicker. I started taking jobs in the city, worked 9 to 5 advertising, whatever, selling business machines. And in 1962, I heard this broadcast on BAI.
Homosexuality is in fact a mental illness which has reached epidemiological proportions.
Where psychiatrists claim they could cure any homosexual with just 6 sessions at $50 or $100 a session. I approached the station and said, look, we homosexuals are the experts on homosexuality. These guys are frauds. They don't know what they're talking about. They said, put together a panel. I'll come and interview them. And they announced in BAI's bulletin that they would have an interview with 8 homosexuals broadcast on August of 1962. I was 24 years old at that time.
In the summer of 1962, billing himself as and we're speaking of Randy here, himself as the public relations director of a group called the Homosexual League, he persuaded WBAI to tape and air a program in which 7 homosexuals talked about their sexuality. Now here's the kicker. When New York Journal American columnist Jack O'Brien criticized WBAI for bowing to the wishes of an arrogant, card-carrying swish.
Card-carrying swish. I was black suit and tie all the way in those days.
And suggested that it change its call letters to WSICK, Wicker used the clipping to get publicity for his program in Newsweek, the New York Herald Tribune, and the New York Times.
And I found out years later through Ed Allwood's great history of the gay press called Straight News, is that some conservative group challenged WBAI's broadcast license, saying this radio station has put perverts on the air. And the Federal Communications Commission ruled that homosexuality was a legitimate subject for discussion on the public airways.
Anybody can challenge a station's license if they can make a case that the station is not being operated in the public interest. And there were some listeners who had decided that having a group of gay men on the radio talking about being gay was not in the public interest, that it was actually propaganda, and that they were trying to lure other people into a gay lifestyle. So they challenged the license and lost.
Well, at that moment, every radio station and every TV station, everybody that wanted ratings, wanted a homosexual spokesperson. There were many members of Mattachine who were just as articulate as me, but they were all mainly people that were in their 30s or 40s and had careers at major corporations, and they were not in a position to go on and become public spokespersons.
The civil rights movement in America was in its embryonic stages, and Randy saw the strategies that the African Americans were using to try to gain rights, and he began to adopt those strategies for the gay rights movement.
So I was the first person to go on TV on Les Crane, flew into Chicago on the Cup Show a couple times. I went on dozens of radio stations, and I had to take these hardball questions.
I'd just like to know, why do homosexuals come to a person and try to, more or less, say things to them which would get them to come with them or things like this?
Try to pick up somebody is what you're saying.
Yeah, right.
I learned how to parry the questions publicly.
Depending on the social circumstances, I think it's within the range of normality that any male will go out and try to pick up someone that he finds attractive. I do not think that people should be grossly offended if someone makes a very subtle overture to them of a sexual nature. You should consider it a compliment that they find you attractive. This doesn't mean that I condone those very few homosexuals that might water in toilets or accost people in a very gross and specifically genital sort of way.
And I found that if you went out and presented your case, that homosexuals were a legitimate minority group, that, you know, that we were entitled to the rights of assembly, rights to buy alcohol, to be free from attack physically, we have a right to hold a job based on our merits.
Americans consider homosexuality more harmful to society than adultery, abortion, or prostitution.
People were willing, even though they thought at the time you were crazy, mentally ill, we were illegal, what we did was criminal activity. People were willing to give you a hearing and to have a civilized conversation about it.
You may have a child or a brother or a relative or even an employee or something who's homosexual. When you find out, you're probably going to fire him because you're going to think, gee, these guys, they hang out and they cause people in
Randy,
public
your biggest
places.
problem is you don't know how to talk. I thank you for calling, sir.
You learn as a public speaker through experience how you even know what stories to tell that they laugh at. One story that was a surefire winner was when I told them and I thought Woody Allen was sort of sexy. Everyone laughed at that, so that was a story I always included in my many conversations.
You look and act like a typical male. Now let me ask you this. Your relationship with your lover, is he effeminate? Do you prefer the effeminate type? Obviously you don't.
No, I prefer average, normal, male-appearing people.
So when the program was broadcast, every state in the Union had laws against sodomy, homosexual behavior, which also covered oral or anal between heterosexuals in every state of the Union except Illinois. The Psychiatric Association had deemed us to be suffering from a mental illness. And also it was against the liquor laws of New York State to serve a homosexual a drink or to allow homosexuals to gather in your place of premises. This went back to 1909 when the Albany legislators came down, found guys on the Bowery in some bar dancing together, some of them wearing dresses even.
People today have a hard time realizing what life was like for people like Randy in the time that they were coming out. And in America, it was against the law for homosexuals to gather in groups. In some places, it was against the law to serve a homosexual an alcoholic beverage. That made bar owners very, very nervous because if they knowingly served a homosexual a mixed beverage, they risked being raided, they risked having their liquor license removed, and they risked going out of business.
And in 1964, we went into several bars, identified ourselves as homosexuals, demanded to be served a drink.
Randy and the Mattachine Society decided to tackle this directly, and several of them got together and decided to hold a sip-in that was modeled after the sit-ins that was being used by the civil rights movement. And they were smart enough to contact reporters and invite them to come along and witness it.
At Howard Johnson's, no problem. 2 or 3 other bars, of course, they served us. Finally, we went into Julius's. Julius's at that time was a mixed bar. They did not want to become a gay bar because gay bars were illegal. And they used to watch their crowds, and if you had too many men and not enough women in a bar at Julius's on a busy night, you could not get into the bar unless you had a female with you. So they kept their bar by managing the door from becoming an exclusively gay bar.
And so Mattachine had been very upset about this. What can we do about this? So we decided, well, we're going to go out and we're going to say that we are homosexuals, but we're orderly. All we want is a drink in this bar.
So when we went into Julius's and identified ourselves as homosexuals and demanded the right to be served, they refused. And we had legal observers, and this became the basis of suing the regulation that the Alcoholic Beverage Commission had, that it was illegal for a homosexual to be served alcohol or to gather in a bar. And that ultimately led to the repeal of that law, which made legal gay bars possible. So we had the right to legally drink. One last thing I want to say was just to show you what life was like. I went and spoke at City College, and 400 people turned out. And the reason for that was no one had ever seen a homosexual spokesperson before. And that was actually reported in the New York Times in January of 1963, and it said only that our Wicker calls for acceptance of homosexuals as a legitimate minority group. The interesting part of it was that some layout man at the New York Times had a great sense of humor, and this news story was published on the women's page. In those days, they had a women's page on the New York Times. So the only homosexuals anyone knew about, Burgess and McLean were Russian spies in Britain. All homosexuals were suspected of being communists. Then there was Leopold and Loeb, the thrill killers from the 30s, and they were, of course, homosexuals were all child molesters and thrill killers. And then on top of that, the only news coverage was a rated drag ball, and you'd see a bunch of drag queens being thrown in the back of a wagon. So all homosexuals are considered to be very effeminate, ran around in dresses. Every time I spoke, one of the first questions were, "Mr. Wicker, when you go home at night, do you put on a dress?" I never in my life had an urge to put on a dress. So the Mattachine Society over the years had slowly grown. It had a membership of 100 or 150 or 200 people. The entire movement nationwide had maybe 400 people. And there were a few newcomers to the movement, like Craig Rodwell, who started the first gay bookstore, people that agreed with me on activism, that we should publicly demonstrate.
There had been a big debate within the gay movement about whether or not we should have public demonstrations. And a lot of it was based on the fear we thought, boy, if somebody knew you were gay, they'd stone you to death or, attack you. We didn't dare walk holding a sign saying that we were homosexuals.
People believed that we went out and publicly demonstrated, it would be stoned to death. I knew better than that because I had been out talking to groups and realized that if you present yourself in a proper way, people will listen to you, give you a hearing. Even if they disagree with you, you can have a civilized conversation. So I had a small band of people in Mattachine, and we decided that we should publicly demonstrate. They kick people out of the Army. You can be 4F if you declare, but you go in and they catch you, you get a dishonorable discharge. And if people really want to serve in the Army, they should be allowed to. So I got together a group of 10 or 12 people, half of whom were heterosexual from the Sex Freedom League. The other half of whom were Mattachine members, like Craig Rodwell and Renee Cafiero.
I was quite new to Mattachine at that time. This was in September of '64, and somebody said, we're going to do a demonstration and it's going to be something brand new. And Nancy and I said, let's go for it.
And we demonstrated down in front of the Whitehall Induction Center saying, allow homosexuals to serve in the U.S. Army. And people didn't scream at us. No one from inside the induction center came out and gave us a hard time. If you had asked me that night, I would have said, not really that great, we couldn't get the news there, blah, 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 blah. It was only like 1988 that I read on the history of the gay movement, the first public demonstration for homosexual civil rights was that demonstration at the Army Induction Center in 1964.
Some people wonder why they held the Whitehall demonstration. Why, during the carnage of the Vietnam War, would anybody want to even be in the military? In fact, some straight people were claiming to be gay to get out of the military. But for people like Randy and Frank Hammoney and Jack Nichols and the others who were at the vanguard, this was a symbol of acceptance. And they wanted so badly to be accepted by culture that they wanted this right too, to be able to serve. Now, what was in the way of their being able to serve was the diagnostic manual that was saying that gays and lesbians had a mental defect. And they knew that if they could get some inroads into the draft, they would then have a shot at the diagnostic manual, which was standing in the way of everything at that point for gays and lesbians. It was the basis for a lot of the discrimination that was happening against them.
8 months later, Jack Nichols talked Hammoney into having a demonstration in front of the White House where they had their first ticket, and the official gay historians like to recognize that as the first public gay demonstration because everyone on that picket line was a homosexual. The argument against the Whitehall Induction Center is that half of the demonstrators were heterosexual.
The first demonstration that got more attention was the demonstration at the White House in April, I think it was 1965, and then there was a series of public demonstrations. And when that series of demonstrations came to an end, Craig Rodwell, one of our most important early leaders, he had a brainstorm and he said, what if we had an annual demonstration to remind Americans that there's one group, there's one minority that still doesn't have its civil rights protected, it's not recognized as a minority.
And the annual parade was actually a joint effort by all these organizations from the East Coast, because we had members in Washington, we had members in New York, we had members in Philadelphia, and where was a natural place to meet. And what day could everyone have off? Everyone is off July the 4th. So it was a central meeting place, and what more symbolic, we're demanding our civil rights, and what better place to demand them than in front of the birthplace of freedom and civil rights in Independence Hall in Philadelphia.
Before the Stonewall Rebellion, there was a group of ordinary citizens taking a stand and picketing for gay rights in front of Independence Hall in Philadelphia.
This is the front of the famous Independence Hall in Philadelphia, and this is where we had gay picketing demonstrations every July 4 from 1965 through 1969. People think of the Stonewall Rebellion as the start of the gay civil rights movement. That's a myth. There was a movement starting back in the late 1940s, and it gradually evolved, and it picked up steam, and we were doing this very revolutionary picketing in the 1960s before Stonewall ever happened.
The reason that the gay and lesbian protesters were dressed well, and that is men with coat and tie and women with dresses, is because they were asking for employment rights, employment protection, among other things. And they wanted to look employable.
We wanted to counter the stereotype of being on the fringe. We wanted to be seen as being like everybody else. And at that time, there were dress codes. You didn't go out in jeans if you wanted to look like somebody who wanted respect.
And they wanted to appear that way in the media so that the public would understand that these were people who deserve the rights of everybody else.
So it's mid-60s, and I'm involved with the Sex Freedom League, the Mattachine Society. My musician friend, whose girlfriend almost died with the abortion, turned me on to some grass, dropped some acid too. And there was the first march against the war in Vietnam in 1964. Allen Ginsberg and the Time magazine said a couple thousand kooks marched up Fifth Avenue protesting the war in Vietnam. And so my vision of life had so expanded, I suddenly realized that there are more important things in life than the fact that homosexuals are being harassed, although they're my people. I mean, there are women dying by the thousand. Drug addicts are dying because we don't have legalized methadone. They're waging a war in Vietnam and sending thousands of people off they're going to eventually die. That was the most horrible thing I ever lived through. So you couldn't get these ideas put out anywhere, and I started printing buttons. So I put out a button that said equality for homosexuals, went to a party in Queens wearing it on my lapel, and that was the greatest night of my life. Everyone came over and talked to me. I took in $38, which in today's dollars is like $240 in those days, right? And I met the best looking guy at the party and took him home. So that was my first success in the button business. So after that, let's legalize pot. So I went down, I started selling marijuana newsletters that I edited. They put me as the first editor. I'm down on Bleecker Street selling copies of the marijuana newsletters, and the cops come and give me a ticket. The ACLU took my case because it's legal to print literature and sell it on the streets of New York City. Williams Burroughs, Allen Ginsberg, Peter Orlovsky, Ed Sanders were the other 4 of the 5 listed editors. And right on the front cover of the first issue of the marijuana newsletter, there's the Wicker Report and Williams Burroughs article. So one button led to another. Civilians must control their police. I started selling them through ads in the Village Voice, and I ended up with this huge drawer of buttons. And I did keep books, and all of a sudden, I was $1,000 ahead. And I looked at the drawer, and the drawer still looked like it was 90% full. I said, gee, if I can do this at just 4 or 5 times the level, I could earn a living in buttons. And so I said, I'm going to try opening a store that sells buttons and posters. And there was an art gallery on St. Mark's Place, and I saw a for rent sign. I went in there, the rent was $150 a month. While I was working at the button shop, I became a gay journalist. Al Goldstein, he said, why don't you write something for a Screw? I said, Al, you wouldn't publish what I'd write. So anyway, I did sit down, take pen in hand, and wrote an article, the opening paragraph of which said, sports fans, if you want to know how to F-U-C-K, you've got to experience it from both sides of the equation. So in 1969, when the Stonewall riots happened, I was running my business in St. Mark's Place. I wasn't over in West Village, I was in East Village, where all the action was, I thought. And I read the newspaper, Daily News story. Queen Bee was stinging mad. She was furious because the night before the cops had raided the Stonewall bar. Another report talked about a flaming garbage can being hailed through the window. The cops inside had their guns drawn and people were almost going to be killed. It was really a life-threatening, violent situation that it took cops from all over the city to come to New York City to finally quell. I walked over the next night on Sunday night with my friend Jack Nichols, and we didn't see much happening. I mean, it was a sporadic thing. It continued on supposedly for days.
June of 1969, the demonstrators weren't dressed up with coat and tie anymore. They weren't trying to make allies. They were throwing Molotov cocktails. They were fighting with police. So what happened? Well, a couple of things happened. One, the entire tenor of the nation changed. More and more we were seeing protests not only from the civil rights movement, but also the student movement and against the war.
And I was asked to speak at a community meeting about this event because I was considered a major gay spokesperson at the time. And I got up and said that we had to be very careful when we get involved with violence, that if, this flaming garbage cans through windows, if one old lady was burned up or someone was damaged, that the homosexuals could be the bugaboos of the 70s, that we should do nonviolence and follow the path of raising issues legitimately, obeying the law, not resorting to criminal acts of violence, that it would ultimately would injure ourselves.
I perfectly understand how initially he was practically terrified at Stonewall that everything he and others had achieved through lobbying for an accurate, fair portrayal of gay people would be blown away, and it could have happened. I mean, we're very lucky that at Stonewall it did not happen. Turned out it was a great success, but that wasn't guaranteed, so Randy's concern at the time was legitimate.
No one saw that this little bar, which had no license, mafia-owned, drug dealing, hustling, that this would somehow capture the imagination of all those thousands of gay people that Mattachine Society had been laboriously trying to get interested in the movement for years. And literally overnight, there were all these incredibly articulate young people speaking out. It was all of a sudden as if instead of just me alone, there were now a dozen equally articulate. Marty Robinson, incredibly articulate person. I felt so good because now I could retire. But in the context of history, I had committed political suicide because instead of getting up and saying, we're not going to put up with this anymore, we're going to raise hell until they give us our rights, I took what I thought was the more common sense approach that it wasn't generally wise policy to throw rocks at cops.
So there was real animosity between him and us Stonewallers. You got to remember, this is 69, 70. It's a period of time of black power, women's power, Puerto Rican power, and Randy to be right-wing, not understanding all that, was anathema to all of us in the gay community. So him going out and doing media and representing us as right-wing, he was considered basically a media whore.
If the Mattachine Society had continued they would have been ignored. They would have been pushed off the front pages by all of the other movements that were doing more extreme things and getting a lot of attention.
I was wrong. You know, I lacked vision. I like to think if I was there, I would have been right there and I would have been with all the others. But because I wasn't there, and I didn't see that this was going to mesmerize and turn this tiny little movement into a mass movement.
It so happened that the annual reminder in 1969 took place about 24 hours after the Stonewall riots ended. Most of the people coming were coming from New York City. Craig Rodwell had organized a bus to bring people in for the demonstrations, and people were all riled up on the bus about Stonewall before they got here. And then when they arrived, they were not in the mood to follow all the rules that had been set down to have orderly demonstrations. And two women who happened to be walking in front of Craig Rodwell began spontaneously holding hands, and Frank Kameny came over and told them they could not do that. That upset Craig Rodwell a lot, and Craig Rodwell attacked Frank Kameny in front of the press, saying that this was no longer appropriate to have these sorts of rules about dress and conduct. So on the way back to New York from Philadelphia, on the bus, Craig Rodwell again felt very depressed. He thought there can never be another annual reminder. People will never be able to follow these rules for demonstrations again as we've had them. But then either on the bus or not long thereafter, Craig, who had a very creative mind, had another brainstorm. And he thought, oh, well, what if we moved the demonstration from Philadelphia to New York because of Stonewall? What if we moved the date from July 4 to June 28, the first night of the Stonewall Rebellion? And he knew he could not put that proposal forward himself, since he had just argued very publicly with Frank Kameny and he would need Frank's support to do that. So what Craig did is he convinced a friend of his to put the resolution before the NACO convention. NACO, I believe, stood for the North Alliance Conference of Homophile Organizations. It was the first truly national coalition of gay organizations. And so when Craig Rodwell put that proposal through his friend before the NACO conference, it passed, which I think is remarkable. That's because Stonewall, really, the riots ended early in July. They had the conference in November. So that means that less than 6 months after Stonewall, there was a willingness on the part of the national level of gay activists to say, we're going to stop this series of demonstrations that's been so successful and institute something new for this rebellion that only happened 6 months ago, in which still people were not sure it was a great thing. Was this going to set the movement back? Was it too wild? So I think it's amazing that the national leadership was willing to embrace such a radical proposal so soon after Stonewall in 1969.
Later, in the first Gay Pride March, I marched up the hill with Prescott Townsend, who was in his late 70s. And I'll never forget, when we looked back, as far as the eye could see, there were hundreds and hundreds of gay people. I said, my God, Prescott, I never thought we'd live to see the day. They really did all turn out. So then I joined Gay Activist Alliance. They were the middle-class gays who said, we're not going to fight the causes of the world. We're not going to argue about black power and all these other issues. We're only going to focus on rights of homosexuals. And they literally became the powerhouse of the gay movement. And even there, I was working as a gay reporter.
Today we're talking to Father Robert Clement of the Church of the Beloved Disciple. Father Clement, what type of church is the Church of the Beloved Disciple?
Like all churches, it's basically first a church for everyone, but our congregation is primarily gay, I'd say 90% approximately, and we exist for the needs of the gay community, and I am gay myself.
And in the process of being a gay reporter, one of the things that I had to cover was I was covering the Dog Day Afternoon. That was what the movie ended up being called, but this fella had robbed a bank to finance a sex change operation for his transsexual boyfriend.
In August of 1972, John Woodowitz attempted to hold up a bank in South Brooklyn at Avenue P and East 3rd Street. This was a very highly publicized bank robbery. one point at which John Wodowitz demanded that his transsexual bride, Ernest Aaron, be brought to the bank, at which point I believe he released a hostage. Now, when you went to the bank that evening, what kind of experiences did you have? I mean, you're somewhat of a, if I dare say, stereotype of a homosexual with tweezed eyebrows, and how did the police react to you?
Well, the police and the FBI were absolutely fantastic. It was unbelievable.
I took Liz Eden, who was the transsexual that John Wodowitz had robbed a bank to pay for a transsexual operation for in 1972, and was going to have his testicles removed, and I picked him up to take him to the castration, and Liz had the operation, which I was very opposed to because she was mentally ill. She hadn't lived for 2 years as a woman, what they do today. And coming home, we heard this long description, reach one testicle, and it hurt up to here. And he got away, and he reached up, and he got it again. But anyway, we got back to the house where the drag queens applauded. We walked in the door, and Liz began telling this story I'd heard 10 times over, once again to the queens there. And I turned to David Combs and said, I can't stand to hear this another time. I feel I need a cocktail. David said, I do too. I probably said, do you want to come over to my house? David went home with me that night in 1972, and that was the beginning of an 8-year relationship with enough of my life. He was the one that got me in the antique business, and we opened this little hole-in-the-wall shop at 506 Hudson Street, where I would continue to work from 1974 till I retired in 2003. He at the time was very much traditional, lower middle class housewife. I was a misogynist, remember, a male chauvinist pig. He came to New York looking for 3 things: a husband, a home, and a job. And in Randy, I found all 3. And things went well in the shop for 5 or 6 years. And after 6 or 7 years, late 70s, instead of growing his hair long and looking like a woman, he cut his hair short, and all of a sudden was wearing another jacket. And where no one had ever looked at him twice before, all of a sudden, all these guys were hitting on him. And he and I, we had a stormy relationship, and there was a brief period of separation, and we came back together. And in the mid-80s, he began getting a black growth on his neck. I got worried at one point because then AIDS suddenly appeared in the mid-80s. And he went to an AIDS doctor who said, I don't see any reason to be concerned. And he recovered. And we ran the store until suddenly he fell ill in 1985 or 6. By that time, we knew what he probably had. And in the process, I had met Marsha B. Johnson. Marsha was a lovable saint of the transgender movement, the most wonderful person I ever knew. She was a wonderful night of my life. She made me laugh, and she was the best friend of my adopted son, Willie. The picture of them going out to the cafes together. She brought laughter in my life. David told me at the time he died, 1990, his 3 favorite people in the world were me, Marsha P. Johnson, and Joseph Sonnenman. Because Marsha lived with me right up till her death in 1992. Sylvia Rivera was a very loud, disruptive presence in Gay Activist Alliance meetings.
I have been beaten. I have had my nose broken. I have been thrown in jail. I have lost my job. I have lost my apartment for gay liberation. And you all treat me this way? What the fuck's wrong with you all? Think about that.
I was very active in Gay Activist Alliance. So I had an occasion as a reporter. They were going to execute a puppy in front of St. Patrick's Cathedral to make the point that it's against the law to execute a puppy in front of St. Patrick's Cathedral. But somehow they're able to beat up and kill drag queens or trans people, and that is of no concern to the police department. So I said, of all the demonstrations I've ever heard of in my life, this is the worst. I went to St. Patrick's Cathedral. There was the ASPCA officer there ready to arrest or give a summons to anyone who tried to lay a hand on a puppy. And No one showed up except one person, Sylvia Rivera, who I knew as a loud, alcoholic, disruptive person. Sylvia Rivera was in drag, which I was very transphobic. And so I said, Mr. Sylvia Rivera came to the demonstration wearing a dress. Mr. Sylvia Rivera, wearing one pink earring and lipstick, said, Mr. Sylvia Rivera. And I sat as an evil, evil journalist throwing poison darts with every paragraph. Mr. Sylvia Rivera. Little did I know that when Sylvia Rivera saw that story, Sylvia Rivera saw more than red. Sylvia Rivera hated me with a passion unequaled. As a matter of fact, there were occasions when people would ask her to be on a panel, and one of her stipulations would be that she would not be on a panel if they involved that horrible transphobic creep, Randy Wicker.
Within the homosexual community, is there an image that the manly homosexual is at the top of the heap? He's the guy who can fit easily into both worlds, and therefore he is king homosexual.
Yeah, I would think so. He's the most attractive.
I don't like that at all.
I mean, because most homosexuals are looking for a man, and they're looking for what society has defined for them for a man. So here's
Is the drag queen then at the very bottom?
Yes.
More or less, yeah.
The drag queen is something we've been stuck with, frankly, because a drag queen makes up about 1% of the homosexual population. I mean, there are thousands and thousands of homosexuals, and you'll have a whole room full of people, and one drag queen will come in, and because that person dresses eccentrically and looks bizarre, that's the one that will get all the attention. And this is from the media. And also it's the only homosexual straight people ever see.
1989, somehow, we both ended up on a stage at the community center at a 20th anniversary celebration of the Stonewall riots. And I was wearing my suit and tie still, because I always wore a suit and tie. I believe you had to look proper. You want people to take you seriously. You look like a businessman, suit and tie, black suit and tie. And Sylvia Rivera commenced screaming at me. And I simply stood there on the stage very calmly saying, "You are not a typical homosexual." She screamed at me and circled around the back of the room and exited the building. Now, Marsha B. Johnson followed Sylvia and said, "Sylvia, you know, you really should give Randy a chance. He's given me a home for the last 9 years. He's not as bad as you think." That fascist, I would give her. I found out about that later. Then the time came that Marsha's body came up from the bottom of the river, and the memorial service, and this is a huge church, 300 people turned out, and I put out a little packet of literature, including a letter from my dog. "Dear Marsha, I miss you so much. I miss you taking me out at 4 in the morning when you come home from the club." And I put Cooey's paw print. It was like a little letter from the puppy to Marsha. Sylvia said that reading that letter made her realize that maybe I wasn't as bad as I seemed to be.
The middle name was Marsha P. Johnson, and the P stands for Pay No Attention!
And when we got the right to march to the river, I said to Sylvia, "Today, for Marsha's sake, we have to bury the hatchet." And we walked at the head of the parade, side by side, carrying Marsha's ashes with her sister and her brother. And Sylvia Rivera and I commenced to talk to one another. And in the process, she told me about the homeless encampment where she was living at. Have you ever spent a winter out of doors in an environment like this?
I spent winters with Marsha and some of the other drag queens. I may spend the winter out here for the simple fact that if I can't see them off the street, why should I go get shelter for myself?
And she would drop by the store after that, and before it was all over, she became not only a friend. I took her in when the blizzard came, her and 4 others from Gay Pier. When the blizzard came, they had to get out. After the interview on the pier in '96, we became very good friends, because then she came here and started working stringing Christmas ornaments. It was just incredible. You know, I said to myself, I said, she wants to work at the store. This queen is going to last 3 hours a day, you know, 2 days at the most. Please, no, you know, but, oh, I'll give her a shot. You know what I mean? Like, it was just enough where I said, oh, I'll give her, you know, I'll give anybody a try. You know what I mean? And then to my amazement, She turned out to be incredible. They tell me, my computer man just told me a couple weeks ago, I didn't know this at the time, but when I would really be getting on Sylvia's nerves, she'd become humming this tune. Yes, we have no bananas, we have no bananas today. Ultimately, she became the manager of my store and my best friend. And I saw her form the transgender movement. And I came to understand through knowing Marsha, the most wonderful person I met in life, and Sylvia, whose story I've told publicly, and publicly apologized at a big meeting up there at NYU, and apologized for the evil venom that I had dripped out of my pen as a gay journalist. The transgender movement is very marginalized, and she had a vision, and she continued to fight for that vision. I mean, on your own deathbed, to summons ESPA, the people from the Empire State Agenda Committee, to your deathbed to plead the case. Don't leave my people behind. Brilliant strategy. In the early 70s, I wrote the article about this horrible demonstration to kill a puppy. Later, discussing it, she said she had never knew that that was the purpose of the demonstration. Sylvia was a professional protester. She went to everything. And through Marsha, I suddenly realized that there were, I should have realized it before because I've always been attracted to men with female personas. But I realized that there were really female personas, the only way I can say, that happened to be living in male bodies. And it took me so long. And then when I realized how wrong I had been, I realized you were so stupid. You got this twisted view of women because you had this awful mother. She was a horrible mother, but she wasn't a horrible mother by choice. I realized my mother was a horrible person and a horrible mother, but it wasn't because she chose to be, it was because she didn't know how to be a good mother. And I finally made peace with that. I was running my lighting shop and I turned on the news.
Dolly is the name of the first mammal, yes, a sheep, ever to be born as the result of cloning. Cloned from an adult sheep in a laboratory. If a lamb, why not a man?
And they said, well, they had managed to clone a sheep. It might be possible to clone a human being. And I really, to that point, didn't even know what cloning was about. And then all of a sudden, I found out that the people that were defending cloning were all saying, well, maybe we should examine the implications of this before we outright banned it. But right after them, there was the Archbishop O'Connor. We must see this is never tried with homosexuals. And all the guys in the dark suits and the proper looking credentials that I knew were homophobes and reactionaries. And I said, man, all the bad people are against it, and no one is speaking out for it. So literally, within 24 hours, I ran down and registered the name Clone Rights United Front and commenced organizing a march to Sheridan Square in support of human cloning. Dolly was announced on Monday. I had my demonstration Saturday, marched into Sheridan Square, singing Hello Dolly. And there was a radio broadcaster there who interviewed me. And it was, well, they could take your DNA and clone, slaves for factories. That was the 1984 version. And I thought, no, because I wouldn't allow that. They said, but your clone could allow that.
The idea of a gay person adopting a child or even having artificial insemination was unheard of, unthought of, and no one would have thought that would be possible. So Randy really was looking at the only creative way he could think of to have a child. When you look at it in terms of it being probably the only logical outlet for a gay man to have a child, it becomes much more understandable.
And I really realized what it was, is I never had a brother or sister, and when I read about identical twins and how they have this incredible companionship, I realized, my God, if I could have, through cloning, a later born twin, he would understand me. Well, I always wanted to have a brother, and I always wanted to have a family. And when cloning came along, because I'm homosexual, I never managed to make an arrangement with a woman. And then suddenly cloning happened, and I thought, gosh, I could have, a child, and it wouldn't involve a stranger's genes. No one has ever understood me because I'm a wacko. And a few people that do like me very, very much, because sometimes I'm bearable, I hope. I closed my store in 2003, and I had bought in 2001 a grave site at Congressional Cemetery in Washington because I wanted to erect the first real monument to trans people in this country. And I want to have a trans day of celebration. You don't know how many people exist in this world that have done incredible things that were trans. The only way for history to remember me, I had my finger in so many pots. And I thought somebody was being politically correct, I'd go, that's the story of my life. A male chauvinist pig who woke up and saw the light, said, oh my God, what have I done with my life? I hope I've improved it. I hope to improve other lives somehow through telling my story.
Philadelphia's National Constitution Center hosted a special event to mark the 50th anniversary of the first LGBT equality protest. Pioneers of the movement were treated to a private tour of a new exhibit called Speaking Out for Equality. That exhibit chronicles the LGBT movement and the ongoing debate over what the Constitution means for gay rights.
The LGBT rights movement in the United States of America, holding the first national protest for gay rights. They're called annual reminders because, of course, they did them every year, starting in that July of 1965. And for the record, it was before Stonewall, right here in the city of Philadelphia. And so I want to ask you to please recognize John James, Paul Kunstler, Randy Wicker. These courageous men and women fought and continue to fight to push for civil rights and equal treatment under the law for lesbian, gay, and bisexual, transgender individuals. They are living heroes, living history right in front of us. They are American patriots in a place where other people stood to fight for rights that all of us enjoy today. Please, one more time, recognize these great American patriots. I live the American dream. I saw our people come from being all criminals, and it's funny, we copied the techniques of the black movement.
Welcome to this marvelous historical moment, a panel on LGBT history, covering an incredible period of time from the 1950s to the present. Closest to me is Randy Wicker, and Randy participated in the original annual reminder, and he's in one of those seminal photos with Barbara Gittings marching in front of Independence Hall, and we call him the last living Mataschino because he's continually fought for the most progressive causes.
I was a male chauvinist pig. And the funny thing was that as I studied and I learned and I grew, that's the point, that we have to learn to change our attitudes. Barbara Gittings and Kay Tobin were the best allies I had in the movement. I was the first male to be on the back page of the ladder, and the whole future of this movement, now as I see it, is not with one in the United States, it's overseas. They've recriminalized in India homosexuality, and guess what? Indian women, lesbians, they're doubly oppressed. They're oppressed as females, and they're oppressed as women because they're homosexuals. So I think the future of the world lies largely with women. Our message to the world should be, we have proven the American dream lives. The bell of liberty rings, and it rings not just in America today, but it rings as a promise of liberty to all people, LGBT people included. We have the secret of how people can come together, talk together, work together, build together, create together, and achieve together, and have peace and a better world together. That's what this whole thing is really about.
Thank you. I think that was the answer to every remaining question.
The National LGBT 50th Anniversary celebration continues with events all across Philadelphia through Sunday.
Thousands filled Independence Mall to listen to the famous Philly Pops.
Through the pioneering efforts of those demanding equality, like 3 individuals who are with us tonight, and I'm going to ask them to stand and remain standing when I call their names. These folks fought for their rights. When you fight for one group's rights, you fight for everyone's rights. And that the LGBT community can now openly serve in our armed forces. And so please recognize Paul Kunstler, Randy Wicker, John James. Please recognize these pioneers, these reminders, these Americans fighting for rights, often alone when no one was paying attention. They never gave up. That's what makes America great.
A very historical and important event occurred right where we are 50 years ago. It was one of the first ever gay protest marches of very courageous people. Said that maybe not all people in this country were receiving the freedoms that our forefathers had prescribed. These folks who came out 50 years ago to march were very, very courageous to do so. It meant that they could lose their job, be ostracized, and even worse. Your initial steps and your courage were certainly not in vain.
Without them doing what they did in 1965 to 1969, we would not have the kind of freedoms that we have today. Adabella, John James, Paul Kunstler, and Randy Wicker.
And I was the 17th member of the New York Mattachine Society when I started my gay activism at the age of 20 in 1958. Thank you so much for your time and your honor.